The chandeliers sparkled like stars in the ballroom of Houston's prestigious Astoria Grand Hotel, where the city's most influential voices had gathered for the annual Voices of Tomorrow charity gala. In a room filled with politicians, CEOs, and community leaders, one figure stood out. Not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself with a quiet, unmistakable strength. Danielle Brooks, a respected philanthropist and CEO, had just delivered the keynote speech, an elegant, impassioned call for unity, justice, and investment in the next generation. As she stepped down from the podium, applause erupted across the room. She had moved hearts, ignited hope, and reminded everyone of what leadership looked like when built on compassion and clarity. No one in that ballroom, least of all Danielle, could have imagined how the night would end. By 11 p.m., the event was winding down. Danielle exited gracefully, her emerald green gown shimmering beneath the warm glow of the entrance lights. Her black Tesla rolled up curbside, and she thanked the valet before slipping into the driver's seat. The streets were quiet as she turned onto Main Street, the soft hum of jazz still playing in her mind. Then came the lights. Red, blue, blinding. Two squad cars boxed her in from both sides without warning. Sirens wailed for a moment, then cut abruptly as three uniformed officers emerged, flashlights raised high. "License and registration," one barked. Danielle lowered her window, remaining calm. "Of course, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" "No rear plate, possible fraudulent tags," he replied flatly. "Step out of the vehicle." "My temporary tags are clearly visible on the front windshield," she explained, voice even. "Step out now." Without protest, she complied. The night air bit against her exposed shoulders as she stood tall on the wet pavement, heels clicking as she moved. Another officer opened her car door and began rummaging through her glove compartment. A third began patting her down, without warning, without explanation, and with no respect. Danielle didn't shout. She didn't argue. But she felt every eye on her, every flashlight glare like a spotlight. Her dignity was being stripped away one silent second at a time. Then one of the officers took a closer look at her license. He hesitated. "Brooks?" he murmured to the others. Danielle's voice cut through the night with clarity and precision. "Yes. I'd like to call my husband now. Chief Raymond Brooks." It was as if the entire street held its breath. The name hit like a hammer. Faces blanched. Radios went quiet. The chief of police? They had just unlawfully detained and humiliated the wife of the top law enforcement officer in the city, and the world would know. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, proud, composed, and unbroken, because what mattered wasn't who her husband was. It was the fact that this could have happened to anyone, and now it had happened to the wrong someone. If you're ready to see what happens when justice comes knocking, press 7 in the comments to keep watching this video. This is just the beginning. The moment Danielle Brooks stepped out of her vehicle, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a demonstration of unchecked power. Her gown, still pristine from the gala, now clung to her in the humid night air. Her heels, which had clicked confidently across the marble floors of the Astoria Grand just minutes before, now echoed on wet pavement under harsh fluorescent lights and the stare of indifferent officers. She stood between two patrol vehicles, boxed in on a side street with no traffic and no witnesses, until one began filming from an apartment window above. The lead officer didn't speak to her again. He turned away, signaling to his partner, who immediately opened the back seat of her Tesla and began sifting through her belongings. Danielle, composed as ever, called out calmly, "I do not consent to a search." The officer didn't look up. "You don't need to. Probable cause." Danielle narrowed her eyes. "What's your probable cause, officer?" "Suspicious behavior. No rear plate. Could be stolen," he replied, not even glancing in her direction. The female officer beside her stepped forward without warning and began patting Danielle down, hands aggressive, impersonal, methodical. Danielle gasped, not out of fear, but out of the insult of it. She had done nothing. No sudden moves, no refusal to cooperate. And yet here she was, treated as if she were dangerous. The humiliation wasn't just physical, It was systemic. Her handbag was turned inside out. Her phone was confiscated for safety reasons. Even her trunk was opened and rifled through without a warrant. Every legal line that should have protected her was being crossed in silence. "You're profiling me," she said quietly. The second officer smirked. "No, ma'am, we're doing our job." Their job? Their job was to protect, not to degrade. Their job was to uphold the law, not weaponize it against someone based on race, gender, or perceived status. But tonight, none of that mattered. What mattered was power, and they thought they held it. Danielle didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She stood still, the embodiment of control in the face of chaos. It was a strength they didn't understand, so they treated it as defiance. "Do you have any weapons or drugs in the vehicle?" one of them asked as if reading from a script. "No," she answered, "and you already know that." Just then, one officer held up her phone. "Looks like a lot of encrypted apps here. You hiding something?" Danielle stared at him. "That's my banking app. I run a tech company." The irony was suffocating. A woman who had just spoken to hundreds about empowering young people through innovation was now being treated as if she were a criminal for having encrypted software, standard in any executive's phone. It wasn't until one of the officers noticed the name on her ID that the temperature changed. "Wait, Brooks?" The silence was immediate. Another officer leaned over his shoulder to look at the screen. A moment of recognition passed between them, a flicker of fear, because they finally realized what they had done. But Danielle didn't flinch. She had told them earlier who she was. She had asked respectfully. She had cooperated. And they had crossed the line anyway. Because blind power doesn't ask who you are. It assumes it already knows. Now the truth was catching up, and the badge they thought would protect them, it was about to turn into the spotlight they couldn't escape. Under the harsh glow of patrol lights, surrounded by suspicion and silence, Danielle Brooks stood like stone, tall, still, and proud. While the officers rifled through her belongings and treated her as a suspect rather than a citizen, she never raised her voice. She didn't plead, she didn't cower, because Danielle knew something the officers didn't. Real power doesn't always come with a badge. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly who you are. As the minutes dragged on, the situation became more absurd. Her luxury vehicle, which only hours ago had carried her to a podium to speak on community empowerment, was now being treated like a crime scene. Her handbag was upturned, her phone scanned without cause, and her professional title ignored. But what stung more than the search was the silence. No one listened. No one cared to ask questions. They didn't want the truth. They wanted compliance. The female officer returned with a small sneer. "Nothing suspicious yet," she muttered to her colleagues. Danielle turned her head, eyes calm but firm. "Yet," that one word, sharp as a scalpel, cut through the air. The officers shifted uneasily, but still, none apologized. None backed down. And then came the moment that shifted the atmosphere. Not with anger, but with clarity. One of the officers, clearly frustrated by her unwavering composure, stepped forward and snapped, "Why are you so calm? You think you're better than the law?" Danielle looked at him, not with defiance, but with something far more unnerving. With quiet dignity, she said, "When you know who you are, you don't let other people define you. And I will not let this uniform, your attitude, or this flashlight take that from me." The silence that followed was immediate. The officers froze, not because she was loud, but because she had just reclaimed the ground they thought they controlled. She hadn't insulted them. She hadn't threatened them. She had done something far more powerful, reminded them that she was a human being, not a statistic or a stereotype. Her words landed harder than any shouted protest. In that instant, the dynamics shifted. One officer, younger and clearly shaken, took a step back. Another avoided eye contact entirely. It was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a moment of reckoning. Because Danielle wasn't resisting arrest. She was resisting erasure. She turned to the officer holding her phone. "You're looking for something to justify this stop, but you already know there's nothing here." He hesitated, then for the first time, glanced down, realizing just how far the situation had spiraled. Danielle straightened her shoulders and looked toward the street. Cars passed in the distance. A siren wailed far away, and somewhere above them, from an apartment balcony, a phone camera continued to record in silence. The weight of that moment wasn't in volume, it was in restraint. And it was in that restraint that Danielle Brooks changed the game. Because what could they charge her with now? Grace? Calm? Clarity? She had followed the law. She had honored their process, even as they failed her. But now the eyes of the world were beginning to turn toward that street. And those same officers who had once spoken over her, they were about to learn that the most powerful voice is the one that doesn't break, even when pushed to the edge. And Danielle Brooks, she hadn't just kept her dignity, she had reminded them of their own. The officers had grown bolder, more confident in their authority as the minutes ticked by. With Danielle Brooks standing silently nearby, they continued their invasive search of her car, her phone, and her body. None of it justified, all of it unlawful. The wet pavement shimmered beneath their boots, illuminated by spinning lights that painted the quiet street in chaotic flashes of red and blue. They assumed this would end like every other overreach. No accountability, no exposure, just another person too afraid to speak out. But Danielle was different. She wasn't afraid, and she wasn't alone. Up until now, she had kept her composure not because she was helpless, but because she understood the system better than anyone there. She had seen what happened when people escalated. She had seen how dignity could be mistaken for defiance and how the wrong word could become a weapon. But at some point, silence becomes surrender, and Danielle Brooks did not surrender. One of the officers, rifling through the trunk of her car, shouted toward another, "Name on the license is Brooks, Danielle Brooks." A brief pause. "Check that in the system," the lead officer ordered. As the younger deputy tapped into the car's terminal, he tilted his head. "Brooks, wait, hold on." His brow furrowed. "We've got a flag here. Danielle Brooks, married to..." Another pause, eyes widened. "Married to Chief Raymond Brooks." The words dropped like a grenade in the middle of the scene. The older officer, suddenly pale, turned sharply. "What did you say?" "She's the wife of the chief, our chief." For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Even the ambient sounds of the city seemed to vanish. The same officers who had spoken to Danielle with such contempt now looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. It was too late. The damage had been done. One of them mumbled under his breath, "You've got to be kidding me." Danielle finally broke her silence, not with fury, but with terrifying calm. "I told you I wanted to call my husband. You chose not to listen." The lead officer, who had barked commands and dismissed every explanation, now stood stiff, his jaw clenched. "We didn't know." She cut him off with a look. "That's the problem." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The truth echoed louder than any siren. "You didn't care who I was. You only cared what I looked like. And now that you know my last name, now you care." From the shadows, a civilian stepped forward. Someone who had been recording the entire incident from across the street. Phone still up, camera still rolling. The officers glanced nervously toward the lens. It was over for them, and they knew it. Suddenly, a low rumble could be heard from the far end of the block. A dark SUV slowly pulling up, headlights off. It came to a stop behind the patrol cars. The passenger door opened. Out stepped Chief Raymond Brooks. Black trench coat, badge on his belt, fury in his eyes. Danielle didn't flinch. She stood still, unmoved, regal even now. The officers snapped to attention, scrambling to explain, but no words came. Chief Brooks walked directly to his wife, gently placed a hand on her shoulder, and looked each officer in the eye. "You searched, restrained, and humiliated my wife without cause. But here's what scares me most. You didn't even check her name before doing it. How many people who aren't married to a police chief go through this and never get justice?" No one answered. They didn't have to. The silence was louder than any defense they could muster, and the camera was still rolling. The tension on the street was like a wire pulled taut. One wrong move, and it would snap. The silence following the revelation of Danielle Brooks' identity had cast a shadow over the officers who had, only minutes before, been acting with unchecked confidence. Now, stripped of their assumed superiority, they stood awkwardly beside their cruisers, each one glancing toward the end of the block where Chief Raymond Brooks' black SUV still idled. But Chief Brooks wasn't alone. From the back of the SUV stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp, dark uniform. His stride was calm but deliberate, boots clicking with quiet authority on the wet pavement. His name was Lieutenant Brian Mathers, Chief Brooks' most trusted officer and longtime friend. He wasn't just a ranking officer. He was a man who'd built his reputation on honor, restraint, and knowing exactly when to speak and when to strike with words. The moment the officers saw him, their eyes widened. It was one thing to realize they had detained the chief's wife. It was another to see his right hand walking toward them. "Lieutenant Mathers reporting," he announced calmly, glancing briefly at Danielle, who stood composed and unshaken. "What do we have here?" No one answered. He turned to the lead officer, whose badge now felt heavier than ever. "Sergeant, would you care to walk me through what justified a warrantless search of this vehicle and a physical search of a civilian without probable cause?" The sergeant opened his mouth, closed it. Mathers pressed. "Was she resisting?" "No," the sergeant muttered. "Was the vehicle in violation of any active criminal warrant?" "No, sir." "Did she pose any immediate threat to officer safety?" "No, sir." Danielle watched from the side, arms crossed, not to protect herself, but to hold back the fire in her chest. She wasn't interested in their apologies. She wanted accountability. Mathers turned to the junior officer who had rifled through her purse. "And you? Did you log any of the items you accessed on her person?" The young officer swallowed. "No, sir." Mathers nodded, then stepped forward to address the entire group. "Let me be very clear. You did not just search the wife of the chief. You unlawfully searched a private citizen who showed no signs of wrongdoing. You overstepped because you thought you could." He turned to the female officer who had performed the pat-down. "Do you recall department protocol regarding physical contact and gender-based searches?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Did you follow it?" She hesitated. "No, sir." The street was so quiet you could hear the rain beginning to patter softly on the rooftops. Mathers looked back to Danielle, who held his gaze with a mix of pride and pain. "I sincerely apologize, ma'am," he said with a slight bow of the head. "On behalf of this department and everyone who still remembers what the badge is supposed to stand for." Danielle didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was low but piercing. "The badge is only as good as the person wearing it." Mathers nodded again. "Yes, ma'am. And tonight, that badge failed you." He then faced the officers once more. "You are all relieved of duty pending investigation. Your body cams, radios, and vehicles will remain on site. Internal Affairs will debrief you shortly." The look in their eyes was no longer confusion. It was fear, and for once, it was the right people who were afraid. Danielle finally turned to leave, Chief Brooks quietly walking beside her. Mathers remained behind to oversee the scene. Before stepping into the SUV, Danielle looked over her shoulder and said to the officers, "It wasn't your mistake that shocked me. It was how comfortable you were making it." The door shut, the SUV pulled away, and justice finally began to move. If you believe in accountability and justice, press 7 in the comments. If not, press 0. But keep watching, because this story isn't done yet. As the last words left Danielle Brooks's lips and the SUV pulled away into the night, the street behind her wasn't as quiet as it seemed. Though the officers had acted as if they were operating in darkness and isolation, they had overlooked one thing. The lens was always watching. In an age where everyone holds a camera in their pocket, the assumption of secrecy is a dangerous illusion. From the second those flashing lights lit up Danielle's rearview mirror, a cell phone had been recording. On the 3rd floor of a modest apartment overlooking the street, Tasha Monroe, a local college student, had noticed the stop. She had been sipping tea by her window, scrolling through social media, when she saw the black Tesla surrounded. Something about it didn't sit right. The officer's posture, their body language, the lack of urgency. She pressed record, zoomed in, and captured everything. Tasha didn't know who the woman was. Not yet. But she knew injustice when she saw it. She captured the aggressive flashlight searches, the unprompted pat-down, the tense exchange when Danielle calmly stated, I'd like to call my husband. His name is Chief Raymond Brooks, and she caught the look on the officers' faces when the name landed like a slap. An hour later, her video, raw, unedited, powerful, was uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "This woman stayed silent, but her name made the whole force panic. Watch what happens when power gets uncomfortable." Justice for Danielle. Know your rights. Within 30 minutes, it had over 100,000 views. By morning, it had gone viral. Across Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Reddit, the clip became a digital wildfire. Users dissected every second. Commentators praised Danielle's composure and shredded the officer's conduct. Civil rights lawyers began reposting the video with threads on unlawful search and seizure. Influencers amplified the clip with captions like, "This is why we film everything," and "What if she wasn't married to the chief?" Overnight, Danielle had become a symbol of both systemic failure and silent resilience. News outlets caught wind by sunrise. Local anchors replayed the video on loop. National media picked it up by midday. Houston police under fire after unlawful search of chief's wife was splashed across headlines. But the story went beyond just Danielle. People weren't shocked only by what happened to her. They were terrified by the implications. Viewers asked the same chilling question: if this happened to the wife of the most powerful officer in the city, what happens to people who don't have that kind of protection? In online comments, citizens began sharing their own stories. Stops without cause, searches without explanation, fear without reason. The video became a mirror. Danielle wasn't just one woman anymore. She was every woman who had been silenced, minimized, or violated under the pretense of protocol. And Danielle? She remained quiet through it all. She didn't post. She didn't tweet. She let the world speak for her, not because she lacked the voice, but because the truth was already louder than anything she could say. The Houston Police Department released a brief statement the next day, acknowledging an incident under internal review. But the public was already 10 steps ahead. Demands for accountability surged. Protests were planned. A press conference was expected. The people weren't just watching, they were awake. And in the middle of it all stood one image: Danielle Brooks, standing tall in the spotlight of a street she never asked to be on. The officers thought no one saw, but the world never sleeps. And this time, the internet didn't forget. Not her face, not their actions, not the silence she shattered without ever raising her voice. The press conference was announced with less than 12 hours' notice. Yet by the time the podium was rolled out in front of Houston Police Headquarters, a sea of reporters, community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens had gathered. The temperature was cool, the skies overcast, and the air charged with anticipation. In a city where headlines faded quickly, this one hadn't, and it wasn't going to. At exactly 10 a.m., the large glass doors opened. Chief Raymond Brooks stepped forward first, dressed not in his usual patrol uniform, but in a navy suit and black tie. His presence was commanding, yet the weight of the previous night hung clearly on his shoulders. Flanking him was Danielle Brooks, poised as ever, her natural grace wrapped in a simple cream blazer and slacks. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, just resolve. The murmuring stopped. All eyes locked onto the couple who had, in a matter of hours, become the face of a national conversation on policing, dignity, and the abuse of unchecked power. Raymond stepped to the microphone, cleared his throat, and paused. "I come to you today not only as your chief of police," he began, "but as a husband, a father, and a black man who understands that what happened to my wife last night is not an isolated incident. It is a systemic issue, one that I can no longer respond to from behind closed doors." A hush fell over the crowd. He recounted the incident in calm, clipped detail. How Danielle was pulled over without cause. How she was searched without consent. How 3 officers ignored both protocol and basic human decency because they believed no one would hold them accountable. And how, had her last name been different, this story might never have reached the public eye. "Let me be very clear," he continued, voice tightening. "If it weren't for a cell phone recording and a brave bystander, these officers would have written their report, moved on with their shift, and buried the truth beneath ink and authority. But this time, the truth had a witness." He turned to Danielle. then stepped aside. She took the microphone slowly, scanning the crowd. Not with defiance, but with unshakable steadiness. "I wasn't pulled over because I did something wrong," she said. "I was pulled over because someone thought they could decide who I was before I had a chance to speak. And when they didn't know my name, they treated me like I had none." Gasps rippled through the crowd. She wasn't just addressing the incident. She was speaking for the thousands who had endured what she endured, without cameras, without connections, without justice. "I didn't come here to make this about me," Danielle added, "because this isn't just about me. It's about what happens every day to people who are silenced before they even open their mouths. My silence last night wasn't weakness. It was strategy, because I knew the moment I raised my voice, they'd use it to justify their fear." She paused. "But now I choose to speak." Flashbulbs exploded. "I want reform. I want retraining. I want civilian oversight. And I want accountability, not just when the victim is married to a police chief, but when the victim is a mother, a student, a janitor, a teenager with a hoodie, or a man walking home." Raymond returned to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This department will change," he said, "not because of pressure, but because it's overdue." The press conference ended without questions. They didn't need to answer anything, because the message had already been heard. The city of Houston had seen press conferences before. It had seen apologies. It had heard promises of internal reviews and procedural adjustments. But what came next was something few expected, and many had long waited for. Less than 24 hours after the explosive press conference held by Chief Raymond Brooks and his wife Danielle, an emergency session convened within police headquarters. Behind closed doors, top legal advisors, internal affairs, and civilian oversight representatives pored over footage, policy manuals, and witness statements. The evidence was damning, the timeline was undeniable, and the pressure from the public was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. At 6 p.m., the department issued a formal suspension order against all 3 officers involved in the illegal stop and search. The announcement came through an official press release stating that Sergeant Kyle Benton, Officer Marcus Vale, and Officer Jenna Cross were immediately relieved of duty, pending full investigation and administrative review. But what no one anticipated was what came next. At 7:14 p.m., as local news anchors began analyzing the suspensions live on air, an unexpected second update hit the wires. Breaking: one officer involved in the Brooks incident faces criminal charges. The city paused. Screens lit up. The internet ignited. The officer named was Sergeant Kyle Benton, the lead officer during Danielle's stop, the one who had ordered the search, initiated the physical contact, and wrote the initial fabricated report stating Danielle had refused to comply and had acted erratically. But the video, captured by bystander Tasha Monroe, told a different story. Danielle had remained calm, articulate, cooperative. She had asked questions, asserted her rights, and never once resisted. The discrepancy between Benton's report and the footage was so blatant that the district attorney's office had no choice. Filing a false report, unlawful search, misuse of authority, 3 charges, felony-level offenses. A line that officers had crossed for years without consequence, finally challenged with the weight of the law. At a hastily called press briefing, the district attorney stood before a packed room of reporters. "Let me be clear. No badge grants immunity from accountability. Our justice system does not differentiate between the powerful and the powerless. What matters is truth, and the truth is on camera." Sergeant Benton abused his authority, falsified documentation, and undermined the very laws he swore to uphold. The reaction was instant. Some in the law enforcement community were stunned. Others were relieved. Public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Online comments flooded in. This is what real accountability looks like. Danielle Brooks didn't just defend herself, she defended all of us. About time someone in uniform was held to the same standard as the rest of us? As news vans surrounded the courthouse and Benton was booked quietly through a rear entrance, his face covered by a hoodie, the department scrambled to manage the optics. But the narrative had already shifted. This wasn't just a procedural review, it was a reckoning. For Danielle, the news brought a strange mix of validation and sadness. She hadn't asked for criminal charges. Her goal had never been vengeance. It had been visibility, reform, dignity. But even she understood that for true change to begin, someone had to be the example. And this time, it wouldn't be the innocent person pulled over on a quiet night. It would be the one who assumed his badge gave him permission to violate another's rights. Chief Brooks released a brief statement later that evening. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. We cannot ask our community to trust us if we don't first hold ourselves accountable. In a country weary of broken promises and delayed justice, the moment marked a shift, not a finish line, but a beginning, because now the system was looking inward. And for once, justice wasn't whispered. It was written in ink, filed in court, and read aloud for all to hear. The woman who once stood in silence beneath flashing police lights, her hands trembling but her voice steady, was now on the front page of every major media outlet in America. Danielle Brooks, once known quietly as a business leader and community advocate, had become a symbol, a face of dignity in the face of discrimination, and a voice for those who had long been silenced. She never asked for the spotlight. In fact, Danielle had spent her life building others up, staying behind the scenes while she mentored young women, sponsored community programs, and supported her husband's reform efforts from the sidelines. But when that humiliating traffic stop thrust her into the public eye, something fundamental changed, not just in how people saw her, but in how she saw herself. At first, she resisted the attention. She declined interviews. She turned down the talk shows and the book deals. She told close friends, "This isn't about fame. It's about fixing something broken." But no matter how far she tried to retreat, the world kept looking to her for strength, for truth, for leadership. And slowly, Danielle began to realize, this moment wasn't just a disruption, it was a calling. Within weeks of the viral video, Danielle was invited to speak at college campuses, legal conferences, and civil rights panels. Not as the wife of Houston's police chief, but as a woman who endured and exposed a system failing its own promises. She used each stage not to relive the incident, but to elevate the conversation. "I didn't speak that night because I was afraid," she told one audience. "I stayed silent because I've learned that sometimes silence lets the world show its true colors. But now, I speak for everyone who didn't get a chance to." Her words resonated, not because they were rehearsed, but because they were raw, authentic, the kind of truth that couldn't be scripted. High school students wore shirts with her image and the quote, "Grace under pressure is not weakness." Activists dubbed her the quiet flame. A national magazine ran a cover story titled, "The Woman Who Made America Listen Without Raising Her Voice." She even became the centerpiece of a citywide initiative, Project Brooks, a coalition of civic leaders and police reform advocates committed to reviewing and rewriting policies on traffic stops, searches, and use of force. The program launched free legal training workshops on knowing your rights, with Danielle's story as the opening case study. But with all the attention came scrutiny too. Critics accused her of leveraging the incident for influence. Others questioned whether her story only gained traction because of who her husband was. Danielle never dodged those questions. She addressed them head-on. "Yes, my husband is the chief of police, but that didn't stop me from being searched illegally. It didn't stop them from treating me like I didn't belong. And if it took my last name to finally get people to care, then so be it. I'll use that privilege to tear the door open for those who don't have it." And she did. By the end of the month, Danielle Brooks was no longer just a name in a news cycle. She was a movement, a turning point, proof that one calm voice, one unjust moment, and one courageous stand could ripple across an entire nation. She didn't ask for this role, but she owned it. And in doing so, she turned her silence into a statement, one that no badge, no headline, and no amount of power could ever ignore again. The street where it all began now looked ordinary again. Quiet pavement, streetlights flickering, and the occasional hum of a car passing by. But for Danielle Brooks, that stretch of road would never be just another intersection. It was where her silence was misread as weakness, where a flashlight to the face became a mirror for a nation, where power tried to press her down, and she stood taller. In the weeks since that night, much had changed. Officers had been suspended, one criminally charged. Policies were being rewritten. Voices once ignored were now at the forefront of public debate. But perhaps the most lasting change couldn't be found in court filings or headlines. It lived in the minds of a generation watching closely, quietly, and taking notes. One moment, one misstep, one woman who refused to break. A clip barely 3 minutes long had sparked outrage, conversations, and reform, but it had also sparked reflection. Teenagers in classrooms discussed Danielle's poise in civics lessons. Parents spoke her name at dinner tables. Church sermons cited her restraint as a model of grace and confrontation. And across social media, the question kept echoing, if that were me, would I have held my ground? Danielle never called herself a hero. She still doesn't. She's a wife, a mentor, a professional, and now, unwillingly but unshakably, a symbol. Not because she shouted, not because she fought back, but because she stood still when everything around her was trying to knock her down. And the cut was never physical, it was deeper. A cut to the illusion that progress had already been achieved. A cut that bled into the conscience of a country still learning to see its own reflection in the people it tries to silence. A moment happened. The world watched. And a generation is still watching, still learning, still waiting to see who will stand next. In a time when voices compete for attention and anger often drowns out wisdom, the story of Danielle Brooks brings us back to something many of us grew up learning. You don't need to raise your voice to raise a standard. Her moment of injustice wasn't unique, but her response was. And it's that response that holds a mirror up to all of us, especially those in the later chapters of life who've seen history repeat, systems fail, and dignity forgotten. Danielle didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't fight. She stood still. She let the system reveal itself. And in doing so, she reminded us that restraint is not weakness, it's wisdom. Many in the younger generation may not understand how powerful silence can be when used with purpose. But those who've lived through the civil rights movement, wartime struggles, or the long road of social change know, sometimes the greatest statement you can make is simply not backing down. For seniors watching this, Danielle's story isn't just inspiring, it's familiar. You've had moments where you were overlooked, underestimated, or mistreated because of your skin color, your last name, or even your age. And yet you pressed forward, not by yelling, but by enduring, not by retaliating, but by standing your ground. Danielle carried that same quiet strength, and it's that strength that turned a private humiliation into a public reckoning. What makes her story so relevant today is how it shows the power of presence. She wasn't trying to go viral. She wasn't looking for attention. She was just being herself, refusing to be reduced. That message, that knowing who you are is more powerful than proving who you are, is something we can pass down to the next generation. It's a lesson that transcends politics, race, or age. Dignity is timeless. Danielle's story also teaches us to use what we have to lift others up. Her platform wasn't built for fame. It was forged through injustice. And instead of walking away from it, she chose to stay in the conversation. She spoke for those who don't have cameras rolling, who don't have powerful last names, and who suffer in silence every day. That's the kind of leadership our world needs, rooted not in ego, but in empathy. For older Americans who sometimes feel forgotten or pushed aside, Danielle's stand proves you're not done. Your story, your presence, your wisdom still matter. Maybe you've been quiet, thinking your time to make a difference has passed. But Danielle didn't need a stage. She made one by standing still. So can you. So what can we all learn? That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I'm still here." That silence, when grounded in truth, can shake institutions. And that grace under pressure, something many of you have lived out your whole lives, is not only noble, it's transformative. If this story touched your heart, press number 7 in the comments so we know you're with us. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone younger, someone who needs to know that quiet strength still changes the world. Stay tuned, because stories like Danielle's aren't the end. They're the beginning.